The grand halls of Ethris Prime glowed with soft blue light. Thousands of crystal lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting gentle shadows on the marble floors. Delegates from across the galaxy walked through the massive doorways, their formal robes flowing behind them like colorful rivers. This was the heart of the Valorian Dominion, the most powerful empire in the outer spiral arm. Their homeworld was a place of beauty, wealth, and ancient tradition. Tonight, they hosted a diplomatic reception for species from dozens of star systems. Sergeant Daniel Cooper stood near the eastern entrance. He wore simple combat fatigues, dark green and worn from years of service. His boots were clean but old. His hands rested at his sides, calm and still. He watched the crowd move past him without expression. He was not supposed to look like this. The human diplomatic team had packed formal uniforms for every member of their security detail. But a cargo mix-up at the last station had sent their bags to the wrong ship. By the time the error was discovered, it was too late. Daniel had only his working uniform. Ambassador Christine Palmer had apologized many times. Daniel had simply shrugged and said it did not matter. He was here to do a job. Clothes would not change that. But standing among the elegant aliens, he felt every stare. The Valorians were tall and graceful, with pale blue skin and silver hair that seemed to float around their shoulders. They moved like dancers, each step precise and beautiful. Their robes were made of fabrics that shimmered, like water under moonlight. Daniel looked like a stone in a garden of flowers. He did not mind. He had learned long ago that what others thought of him meant very little. Actions mattered. Results mattered. Words were just noise. Across the hall, a group of young Valorians gathered near a fountain. They laughed and whispered to each other, their voices like soft music. At the center of the group stood a young female with hair brighter than the others. Her gown was pure white, marked with golden symbols that showed her high status. Her eyes were sharp and proud. This was Lyara Velshin, the only daughter of High Matriarch Celine Velshin, ruler of the entire Valorian Dominion. She had never known struggle. She had never known fear. Her whole life had been filled with luxury, praise, and power. Lyra noticed the human standing alone by the door. She tilted her head and studied him with open curiosity. Then her lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. She whispered something to her friends. They giggled. Then, with her entourage following close behind, she walked toward Daniel. Daniel saw her coming. He kept his posture straight and his face neutral. He had dealt with difficult people before. He expected nothing different here. Lyara stopped a few feet away from him. She looked him up and down slowly, as if examining a strange insect. "So," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "This is a human." Daniel gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am." Lyara circled him once, her friends watching with entertained expressions. "I have heard stories about your kind. They say you come from a heavy world, a world of storms and predators. They call you Deathworlders." She paused in front of him. "But looking at you now, I see nothing impressive. You are small. You are plain. You dress like a servant." Daniel remained still. "My formal uniform was delayed, ma'am. I apologize if my appearance causes offense." Lyara laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Offense? No, no. I am not offended. I am simply confused." She gestured at the grand hall around them. "This is a royal reception. Leaders and warriors from across the stars have come to honor the Dominion. And your people send this," she pointed at Daniel, "a common soldier in dirty clothes?" Her friends laughed behind her. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed calm. "I am here to protect my team, ma'am. That is my only duty." Lyara stepped closer, her silver eyes cold. "Protect? How would you protect anyone? Humans have no history, no great warriors, no legends. You crawled out of your little planet just a few generations ago. You are infants in the galaxy." She tilted her head. "Tell me, human, do your people even have pride? Or did you lose that too, along with your proper clothes?" The hall had grown quieter. Several nearby delegates turned to watch. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply observed. Daniel looked at Liara directly for the first time. His brown eyes were steady and unreadable. "We have pride, ma'am. We just don't need to prove it with words." For a moment, something flickered in Lyra's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or uncertainty. But it vanished quickly. She smiled again and turned to her friends. "You see? They have no fire, no spirit. This is why humans will never be more than footnotes in galactic history." Her entourage murmured in agreement. Liara gave Daniel one last look of disdain. "Go back to guarding your door, human. Try not to embarrass your species any further tonight." She walked away, her friends following like shadows. Daniel watched her go. His hands remained still at his sides. His face showed nothing. But deep inside, something old and painful stirred. He pushed it down, as he always did. Across the hall, Ambassador Palmer had witnessed everything. She stood near a pillar, her expression tight with controlled anger. She caught Daniel's eye and gave him a small nod. A signal. Stay calm. Do not react. Daniel returned the nod. He turned back to watch the entrance, resuming his duty as if nothing had happened. But near the servants' entrance, two Valorian attendants exchanged worried glances. One of them, an older male with lines of age on his blue face, leaned close to the other. "That young fool," he whispered. "Does she not know who that human is?" The younger servant frowned. "What do you mean?" The older one shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on Daniel's back. "That is the human from Nexus Station." The younger servant's face went pale. That cannot be." "It is." The older one's voice was heavy with something between awe and sorrow. "Someone needs to tell the matriarch before this gets worse." He slipped away through a side door, leaving the younger servant staring at the quiet human soldier who stood alone, watching the stars through the tall windows, carrying a weight that no one in that glittering hall could see. The reception continued late into the night. Music floated through the grand hall as delegates shared drinks and empty pleasantries. Alliances were hinted at. Trade agreements were whispered about. It was the kind of evening where words meant little and hidden meanings meant everything. Liara Velshin stood with her circle of friends near the crystal fountain. She was still smiling from her earlier encounter with the human soldier. Her friends praised her wit and boldness. They told her she had put the primitive creature in its proper place. "Did you see his face?" One of her friends, a young noble named Kira, said with a laugh. "He had nothing to say. Absolutely nothing." Another friend, Tellus, nodded eagerly. "Humans really are as dull as they say. No culture, no refinement. Just dirt-covered soldiers pretending to matter." Liara sipped her drink, enjoying the attention. "They should be grateful we allow them at our gatherings at all. 100 cycles ago, they were still fighting wars over patches of land on their single little planet." Our friends laughed in agreement, but not everyone nearby shared their amusement at a table across the room. A group of older Valorian nobles sat together. Their faces were serious. They spoke in low voices, glancing occasionally at Liara and her young friends. Counselor Tarn, a senior advisor to the matriarch, set down his glass and frowned. He was old, even by Valorian standards. His hair had faded from silver to white, and deep lines marked his face. He had seen wars. He had seen peace. He had seen heroes rise and empires fall. And he had seen what happened at Nexus Station. Someone should speak to her, one of the other nobles muttered, before this becomes a diplomatic incident. Taran shook his head. Speaking to Lyara is like speaking to a storm. She hears only herself. He rose from his seat slowly, his old bones protesting. I will speak to the matriarch instead. He walked toward the private corridors, leaving his companions behind. Meanwhile, Lyra's friend Myra had grown quiet. She was a gentle soul, less interested in politics and more interested in art and history. While the others continued mocking humans, Myra's thoughts wandered. She had heard something earlier. A whisper from the servants near the kitchen. Something about the human from Nexus Station. She did not know what it meant, but the way the servants had said it made her uneasy. There was fear in their voices. And something else. Something like reverence. Lyara, Myra said softly, touching her friend's arm. Perhaps we should not speak so loudly about the human. I heard the servants mention something strange. Lyara raised an eyebrow. What servants? What did they say? They called him the human from Nexus Station. I do not know what it means, but they seemed afraid. Lyara rolled her eyes. Servants gossip about everything. It means nothing. She waved her hand dismissively. All humans look the same to me anyway. Ugly and boring. Myra said nothing more, but she could not shake the feeling that something important was happening. Something they did not understand. Outside the grand hall, Daniel Cooper stood alone on a wide balcony. The night air was cool and clean. Above him, 3 moons hung in the dark sky, surrounded by countless stars. He leaned against the stone railing and looked up at the universe. Somewhere out there, millions of light years away, Earth still spun on its axis. People still lived their lives, unaware of the vast and dangerous galaxy beyond their little world. Daniel had not seen Earth in 6 years. He wondered if his mother still kept flowers in the window. He wondered if his younger brother had finished school. He wondered about many things he would probably never know the answers to. His left forearm ached. It always did when he was tired. He reached over with his right hand and touched a long scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. The skin there was rough and uneven. A reminder. The balcony door opened behind him. Ambassador Christine Palmer stepped outside, her formal gown rustling in the breeze. She was a small woman with kind eyes and a sharp mind. She had worked in galactic diplomacy for 20 years, and she had seen the best and worst that the universe had to offer. She stood beside Daniel and looked up at the moons. Beautiful night, she said. Yes. Ma'am. You handled that well. Inside. Daniel shrugged. Words don't leave scars. Palmer glanced at his arm. No, she said quietly. But Nexus Station did. Daniel said nothing. They stood in silence for a long moment, 2 humans alone in a galaxy that often forgot them. You didn't have to come on this mission, Palmer said finally. I could have requested someone else. I wanted to come. Why? Daniel turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were tired but clear. Because running away doesn't fix anything. Because I made a promise to keep going. And because someone has to remind them that humans are more than what they think we are. Palmer nodded slowly. Just be careful. Some wounds don't heal by pretending they aren't there. I know. She reached out and touched his shoulder briefly. Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow will be long. She went back inside, leaving Daniel alone with the stars. Deep within the palace, Counselor Taran walked quickly through the private corridors. Guards nodded as he passed. Servants stepped aside. He was one of the few people who could approach the matriarch without appointment. He reached the heavy doors of her private meeting chamber and knocked twice. A voice from inside called, Enter. Taran pushed open the doors and stepped into the room. High Matriarch Celine Velshin sat at a long table covered with documents and holographic displays. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair that fell past her shoulders. Her face was calm but intelligent. She looked up as Tarn entered. "Counselor, this is unexpected. Is something wrong?" Tarn closed the door behind him and approached the table. He leaned close and spoke in a low voice. "The human soldier in the Grand Hall. The one from the security detail." Celine frowned slightly. "What about him?" "It is Daniel Cooper." The matriarch's expression froze. "Cooper," she repeated. "From the Steadfast?" "Yes." Celine set down the document she was holding. Her calm mask slipped, revealing something raw beneath. Fear, gratitude, shame, all at once. "Does anyone else know?" "Some of the older nobles suspect. The servants have already begun whispering." Tarn paused. "And there is more." Celine's eyes sharpened. "Tell me, your daughter approached him earlier this evening. She mocked him publicly, called him a primitive. A footnote. She did not know who he was." For a long moment, Celine did not move. Then she closed her eyes and took a slow breath. "Where is my daughter now?" "Still in the Grand Hall." Celine stood. Her face had become stone. "Summon her to my private chamber, immediately. And Tarn, make sure no one else speaks of this until I have dealt with it." Tarn bowed. "Yes, matriarch." He hurried from the room, leaving Celine standing alone. She turned to the window and looked out at the night sky. Somewhere in her palace, a man who had bled for her people stood in silence, carrying burdens that her own daughter could not begin to imagine. And Celine knew that before this night was over, painful truths would need to be spoken. Liara walked through the private corridors of the palace with growing confusion. A servant had found her in the Grand Hall and delivered a message. The matriarch wished to see her immediately. No explanation. No context. Just a command. This was unusual. Her mother rarely interrupted social events for private meetings. And the servant's face had been pale, almost frightened. What could possibly be so urgent? Liara reached the heavy doors of her mother's private chamber. 2 guards stood on either side, their expressions blank. They opened the doors without a word. The chamber inside was large, but simple. Stone walls. A wide window overlooking the night sky. A long table covered with documents and maps. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing data that Liara did not understand. Her mother stood near the window, her back turned. She did not move when Liara entered. "Mother?" Liara said. "You wanted to see me?" Celine turned slowly. Her face was unlike anything Liara had seen before. Not angry exactly. Something deeper, colder. "Close the doors," Celine said. Liara did as she was told. The heavy doors sealed shut with a soft click. "Sit." Liara sat in a chair near the table, her confusion growing. "Mother, what is this about? Did something happen?" Celine walked to the table and stood across from her daughter. Her silver eyes were hard. "Tell me," she said quietly, "exactly what you said to the human soldier tonight." Liara blinked. "The human? That is what this is about? Answer my question." I simply spoke to him. Put him in his place." Liara tried to smile. He was standing there looking ridiculous in his common clothes. I reminded him that humans are newcomers to the galaxy, that they have no history worth mentioning. That is all. Celine's expression did not change. "What else?" Liara shifted uncomfortably. I asked if his people had any pride. I told him humans would never be more than footnotes in galactic history. She lifted her chin. I was not wrong. Humans are primitive. Everyone knows this. For a long moment, Celine said nothing. Then she walked to one of the holographic displays and touched it. The image changed, showing a news archive from 3 cycles ago. "Do you know what this is?" Selene asked. Liara looked at the display. It showed a space station, dark and damaged. Emergency lights blinked in the wreckage. The words "Nexus Station Incident" floated above the image. "I have heard of it," Liara said slowly. "Something about the Kreth War. A station was attacked." "Something about the Kreth War," Selene repeated. Her voice was ice. "That is what you know?" "Something?" Liara said nothing. Selene touched the display again. The image expanded, showing detailed records, video footage, and casualty reports. "Nexus Station was a neutral medical outpost," Selene began. 3 cycles ago, during the height of the Kreth Dominion's expansion, we evacuated over 2,000 Valorian refugees there. Civilians, families, children. She paused. The station was supposed to be safe. The Kreth had signed treaties promising to respect medical facilities. Liara watched the images scroll by. Faces of Valorian families. Lists of names. "The Kreth broke their word," Selene continued. "They sent an assault force to Nexus Station. Not to capture it. Not to negotiate. To slaughter everyone inside. They wanted to break our spirit. They wanted to show the Dominion that no one was safe." Liara felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened?" Selene touched the display again. A new image appeared. A small human ship, battered and scarred from battle. "The Steadfast," Selene said. "A human patrol vessel." It received the station's distress call and responded. It was the only ship close enough to help. Liara stared at the image. The ship looked tiny, fragile. "The Steadfast carried 12 human soldiers," Selene continued. 12, against over 200 Kreth warriors. They were outgunned 20-1. Any logical analysis would say they had no chance. They should have retreated. They should have called for backup and waited. She turned to look at her daughter, but they did not retreat. They boarded the station and fought. The display changed again. Security footage from inside Nexus Station. Liara watched as human soldiers in heavy armor moved through smoke-filled corridors. Energy blasts flew past them. Kreth warriors charged with bladed weapons. And still, the humans pushed forward. "They held the station for 9 hours," Selene said. 9 hours of continuous combat. They protected the evacuation routes. They carried the wounded. They shielded children with their own bodies. Liara could not look away from the footage. She saw a human soldier take a blast to the chest and keep fighting. She saw another drag a wounded Valorian to safety while firing his weapon with one hand. Of the 12 humans, Selene said quietly, only 3 survived. The display changed one final time. A single image filled the screen. A human man, covered in blood and burn marks, standing in a ruined corridor. His armor was shattered. His left arm hung at a strange angle. In his right arm, he held a small Valorian child, no more than 5 cycles old. The child's eyes were closed, her tiny hands clutching his torn uniform. Behind him, the bodies of Kreth warriors lay scattered across the floor. The man's face was exhausted, broken, but his eyes were still focused. Still determined, Liara recognized him. Her blood turned to ice. "That," Selene said slowly, "is Sergeant Daniel Cooper. The man you mocked tonight. The man you called a primitive." A footnote. Liara could not speak. Her throat had closed completely. "He carried 17 children through that corridor," Selene continued. 17. One at a time. Through enemy fire. Through flames. Through hell itself. Her voice cracked slightly. He was shot twice during the final evacuation. He lost consciousness as he handed the last child to a rescue medic. They did not think he would survive. The display showed more footage. Daniel being carried onto a medical ship. doctors working frantically to save him, Valorian survivors crying and reaching toward him. 2,000 of our people survived because of those 12 humans, Celine said. Because of him. My cousins were on that station. House Beltran, one of our oldest noble families, still exists because a human soldier refused to let their children die. Liara felt tears running down her face. She did not remember starting to cry. And tonight, Celine said, her voice rising for the first time, my own daughter stood before him and called his people worthless, called them forgettable, asked if they had any pride. Liara looked up at her mother. I did not know, she whispered. Mother, I did not know. No, Selene agreed. You did not. Because you never bothered to learn. Because you assumed that your status made you wise. Because you believed that cruelty was the same as strength. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. That man asked for nothing after Nexus Station. No medals, no titles, no recognition. He returned to active duty as soon as his wounds healed. He had spent 3 cycles serving quietly, protecting others, never once speaking of what he did. Liara buried her face in her hands. He did not fight for fame, Selene said. He fought because children were dying and someone had to stop it. That is who he is. That is what humans are capable of. She straightened and walked to the window. Now tell me, daughter, what kind of person mocks a hero to his face? Liara had no answer, only silence and shame. Liara sat alone in her private chambers. The lights were dim. The curtains were drawn. She had been sitting in the same chair for hours, staring at nothing. The holographic display in front of her played the Nexus Station footage again. She had watched it 7 times now. Maybe 8. She had lost count. Each time, she hoped it would feel different. That somehow the weight of what she had done would grow lighter. It never did. The footage showed interviews with survivors. Valorian mothers holding their children, tears streaming down their blue faces. Speaking about the human soldiers who had saved them, one mother, barely able to speak through her sobs, said, "They came from nowhere. We did not even call them. They just came. And they died for us. Strangers. They died for strangers." Another clip showed a Valorian child, now grown into a young adult. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were distant, haunted by memories. I was 5 cycles old when the Kreth came, she said. I remember the explosions, the screaming. I remember hiding under a medical bed, crying for my mother. And then a human found me. He was bleeding from his head. His armor was broken, but he picked me up and held me against his chest. She paused, struggling to continue. He told me to close my eyes and hold on. He said he would not let me go. And he did not. Even when he was shot twice, he did not let me go. I felt the impact when the blasts hit him. I felt him stumble, but he kept walking. He carried me through fire and death, and he never let me go. Liara turned off the display. She could not watch anymore. She pressed her hands against her face and tried to breathe. Her chest hurt. Her eyes burned from crying. And somewhere deep inside, a terrible truth had taken root. She was not the person she thought she was, all her life. She had believed herself to be intelligent, cultured, superior. She had looked down on other species with casual contempt, confident that her bloodline and her status made her better than them. But what had she ever done? What battles had she fought? What lives had she saved? What sacrifices had she made? Nothing. She had done nothing. She had lived in comfort and luxury, surrounded by servants who praised her every word. She had never been tested, never been challenged, never had to prove that she was anything more than a spoiled child born into power. And the first time she met someone who had truly suffered, who had truly sacrificed, she had mocked him to his face. A knock came at her door. Lyara wiped her eyes quickly. Enter. The door opened and Mira stepped inside. Her friend's face was pale and uncertain. Lyara? I heard you were summoned by the matriarch. Is everything all right? Lyara laughed bitterly. No, nothing is all right. Mira closed the door and walked closer. What happened? The human I mocked tonight. Do you know who he is? Myra hesitated. I heard the servants talking. They said something about Nexus Station, but he is the hero of Nexus Station. Lyra's voice cracked. He saved 2,000 Valorians. He carried children through enemy fire while being shot. He nearly died protecting people he had never met. People from a species that treats humans like inferior animals. Myra's face went pale, and I stood before him and called his people worthless. Lyara continued. I asked if they had any pride. I told him humans would be forgotten by history. She buried her face in her hands again. I am a monster. Mira, a stupid, cruel, arrogant monster. Myra sat down beside her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You did not know. That does not matter. Lyara looked up sharply. Even if you were not a hero, I had no right to speak to him that way. He was a guest in our halls. He had done nothing wrong, and I treated him like garbage because I could, because no one was going to stop me. She stood abruptly and walked to the window. Do you know what my mother said? She asked what kind of person mocks a hero to his face. Lyara pressed her forehead against the cold glass. But the real question is worse. What kind of person mocks anyone to their face? What kind of person finds joy in cruelty? Mira was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke quietly. I knew. Lyara turned. What? I knew who he was. Mira could not meet her eyes. Not at first. But after I heard the servants talking, I realized. And I said nothing. Why? Myra's voice was small. Because you are the matriarch's daughter. No one corrects you. No one tells you that you are wrong. We all just go along with whatever you say. Lyara stared at her friend. The words hit her like physical blows. So I have become the kind of person that no one dares to correct, she said slowly. The kind of person whose cruelty goes unchallenged because everyone is afraid of my status. Myra nodded miserably. Lyara turned back to the window. Outside, the 3 moons had risen higher in the sky. Their light cast long shadows across the palace gardens. Somewhere in this palace, Daniel Cooper was probably lying in his quarters, unable to sleep. Not because of what she had said to him. She suspected he had truly moved past such things long ago, but because of the memories he carried. The faces of friends who had died beside him. The sounds of battle. The weight of survival. He had lived through hell, and she had greeted him with scorn. I have to make this right, Lyara said. How? I do not know yet. She straightened her shoulders. But I cannot leave things as they are. I cannot pretend this did not happen. She walked toward the door. Where are you going? Myra asked. To find him. To apologize. But when she reached the guest wing and asked a servant about the human soldier, she received troubling news. Sergeant Cooper has requested to remain in his quarters for the rest of the reception, the servant said. He did not wish to cause difficulties. Lyara felt the words like a knife. He was hiding. Not because he was embarrassed, but because he did not want to make things awkward for her. Even after everything, he was thinking about others. She returned to her mother's chamber instead. Celine was still there, sitting at her desk, reviewing documents in the dim light. Mother, Lyara said from the doorway, I need your guidance. Celine looked up. Her expression was still stern, but something softer flickered behind her eyes. What would you have me do? Lyara asked. How can I make this right? Celine set down her pen and studied her daughter for a long moment. If a stranger saved your life, she said finally, and you spat in their face without knowing, what would you do? I would apologize. Would a private apology be enough? Or would the insult require a public correction? Liara understood. The mockery had been public. The repair must be public as well. I must face him before everyone, she said quietly. I must admit what I did. And I must show him the respect he deserves. Celine nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning, there will be a formal assembly. All delegates will attend. I will make arrangements. She rose and walked to her daughter. This will be difficult, Celine said. You will have to humble yourself before the entire galaxy. Your reputation will suffer. People will talk about this moment for generations. Liara met her mother's eyes. Good. Maybe then others will learn from my mistake. For the first time that night, Celine smiled. Just slightly. There may be hope for you yet, my daughter. She placed a hand on Lyra's cheek. Rest now. Tomorrow, you begin the hard work of becoming someone worthy of the title you will one day inherit. Lyra nodded and left the chamber. She did not sleep that night, but for the first time, her tears were not only from shame, they were from something new, something that felt almost like hope. The Grand Hall was full again the next morning. Delegates from dozens of worlds stood in careful rows, their colorful robes creating a sea of fabric and light. Whispers passed between them. Something unusual was happening. The matriarch had called a formal assembly without explanation. Servants moved quickly along the edges of the room, preparing the central dais. Guards stood at attention near every door. The energy in the air was tense and uncertain. Near the back of the hall, Daniel Cooper stood with Ambassador Palmer and the rest of the human delegation. He had tried to refuse the summons, but Palmer had insisted. Whatever was about to happen, the humans needed to be present. Daniel kept his face neutral, but his instincts were alert. He had survived too many surprises to relax in situations like this. The main doors opened. The crowd parted. And Lyra Velshin walked into the hall. A collective gasp rose from the assembly. Lyra was not wearing her royal finery. Instead, she wore a simple white gown, undecorated and plain. Her silver hair hung loose around her shoulders, without jewels or ornaments. Her feet were bare against the cold marble floor. Daniel recognized the significance immediately. He had studied Valorian customs before this mission. The white gown was the garment of humility and penance. It had not been worn by anyone of noble blood in over 200 cycles. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Lyra walked slowly through the assembly, her eyes fixed on the central dais where her mother waited. She did not look at the faces around her. She did not acknowledge the stares and murmurs. She climbed the steps and stood beside the matriarch. High Matriarch Celine Velshin raised her hand. The hall fell silent. Honored delegates, Selena began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. I have called this assembly to address a matter of honor, a debt that the Valorian Dominion has failed to properly acknowledge. She paused, letting the words settle. 3 cycles ago, during the Kreth War, our people faced extinction at Nexus Station. Over 2,000 Valorian civilians, including children, were trapped and hunted by enemy forces. Death was certain. The older delegates nodded grimly. They remembered. But death did not come, Selene continued, because a human patrol ship called the Steadfast answered our distress call. 12 human soldiers, outgunned and outmatched, chose to fight instead of flee. They held the station for 9 hours. They protected our people with their lives. She gestured to the side of the hall. Only 3 of those soldiers survived. One of them stands among us today. All eyes turned toward Daniel. He felt the weight of hundreds of stares. His jaw tightened, but he did not move. Sergeant Daniel Cooper, Celine called. Please come forward. Daniel hesitated. Ambassador Palmer touched his arm and nodded. He walked through the crowd. each step feeling heavier than the last. He hated this. He had never wanted recognition. He had only wanted to do his job and forget. But he could not refuse. Not here. Not in front of everyone. He reached the dais and stood at attention, facing the matriarch. Celine looked at him with eyes full of gratitude and sorrow. "Sergeant Cooper," she said, "you asked for nothing after Nexus Station. You expected nothing. You returned to your duties as though your blood had not been spilled for our children. You have never spoken publicly about what you did." Daniel's voice was steady. "I was just doing my job, ma'am." "No," Celine said firmly. "You were doing far more than that. And the Valorian Dominion has been silent for too long." She turned to the assembly. "This man is a hero. Not because he sought glory, but because he acted when action was needed. Because he chose to protect strangers at the cost of his own blood. Because he represents everything that we claim to value, but so often fail to practice." The hall was completely silent. Celine took a breath. "And yet, despite all of this, my own daughter, in her ignorance, greeted him with mockery and scorn." The crowd stirred. Shocked glances passed between delegates. Liara stepped forward. Her face was pale but determined. "I am Liara Velshin," she said, her voice clear despite its trembling. "Daughter of the matriarch, heir to the Valorian throne." She turned to face Daniel directly. "Last night, I approached you with cruelty. I called your people primitive. I questioned your pride. I said humans would be forgotten by history." Daniel watched her without expression. "I was wrong," Liara continued. "Not just because you are a hero, but because no one deserves to be treated that way. You were a guest in our halls. You had done nothing to offend me. And I attacked you because I could. Because my status protected me from consequences. Because I had never learned that power without wisdom is just cruelty wearing a crown." Tears began to fall down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. "I cannot undo what I said. I cannot erase the insult. But I can stand before you now, before all these witnesses, and say that I was wrong. That I am ashamed. And that I will spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of the sacrifice you made for my people." She lowered herself to the floor and bowed the Valorian bow of profound respect. Her forehead touched the cold marble. Her arms stretched forward in complete submission. The crowd gasped. No heir to the throne had ever bowed like this. Not to anyone. Not in recorded history. Celine watched her daughter for a moment. Then she two-stepped forward and bowed her head toward Daniel. One by one, other Valorians in the hall began to bow. The older nobles, the council members, the servants along the walls. Even delegates from other species lowered their heads in respect. Daniel stood, alone in a sea of bowed figures. He did not know what to say. His throat was tight. His eyes burned with emotions he had buried long ago. He stepped forward and gently touched Lyra's shoulder. "Please stand," he said quietly. Lyra rose slowly. Her face was wet with tears. Daniel looked at her with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, only a deep and weary kindness. "I did not do it for thanks," he said. "I did it because those kids were scared, and someone had to help. That is all. That is the only reason." Liara wiped her eyes. "Then let me spend my life becoming someone who helps too." Daniel almost smiled. That would be enough. The assembly remained silent as Liara returned to her mother's side. Celine placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and squeezed gently. Ambassador Palmer stepped forward and spoke to the crowd. "The human delegation accepts this gesture of reconciliation with gratitude. We hope it marks the beginning of a stronger alliance between our peoples." The formal assembly ended shortly after. But something had changed in that hall. Something that could not be measured in treaties or trade agreements. A bridge had been built. Not between governments, but between hearts. 3 cycles later, a human Valorian joint relief mission arrived at a colony devastated by natural disaster. Dozens of workers spread across the damaged settlement, treating the wounded and distributing supplies. Among them was a young Valorian woman in a medic's uniform. Her silver hair was tied back practically. Her hands were skilled and gentle as she treated a frightened alien child. "Why do you work with the humans?" the child asked. Lyara smiled softly. "Because a human taught me what real strength looks like." Across the medical bay, an older man looked up from his work. His hair had more gray now. His movements were slower than they once were, but his eyes were still kind. Daniel Cooper caught Lyra's gaze and gave a small nod. She nodded back, and somewhere in the vast galaxy, a tiny moment of understanding proved that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the greatest arrogance could transform into wisdom. And that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was not fight, but bow.